Ping, ping.
Hello and welcome. Good day, everyone. My name is Kayla Johnston, and I'm going to be your host for today's NCTR dialogue, focusing on research. The number to call if you need to talk to someone is toll free. You're going to see that ticking across the bottom of the screen throughout the discussion. And today we have two guests joining us who have experience in this area of research and whose focus really has been around residential school based records and work. So, over the next hour, we're going to be discussing some of the challenges, some of the successes, a couple of tips for accessing documents that may be helpful, and learning more about yourself or your family and the experience in residential schools. But with that, I want to extend a big welcome. Joining us today here from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is Jessie Boiteau, who is currently the Acting Director of Research and Archives. And joining us from Shingwauk Residential School Center in Sault Ste. Marie is Jenna Lemay. But with that, I first want to give a little bit of a platform for Jenna to introduce herself and then take it back over to Jessie before we jump right into the content today. So Jenna, the floor is yours for a quick introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Kayla. Hello, everyone. This is my first time doing one of these NCTR dialogues, so I'm glad that Kayla gave me a moment to introduce myself. So I am the Digital Archives Technician at the Shingwauk Residential School Center, which is located in Sault Ste. Marie at Algoma University, which is on the site of the former Shingwauk Indian Residential School. And Sault Ste. Marie, also known as Boiteau, is part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory and is the traditional lands of Garden River First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, as well as a historic Métis community in Sault Ste. Marie. So we have lots of stakeholders on the site that we work with, in addition to the survivors of the Shingwauk Residential School. The Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association is the survivor organization that we work very closely with at the SRSC. We are jointly governed by Algoma University and the survivors. So everything we do at the center is run by them. So a lot of the work that I do is done with their input or at their urging. They really are in charge of us, which is it's great. It's very much a privilege to work with them. So my work focuses on digital preservation, digital access, digitization, all the sort of digital things. So for people who aren't able to come on site, I work with them to get access to records or information, or give them tours of the site. We do have a virtual tour project that is so close to being finished. This has been something I've been working on over the last couple of years. I also am a genealogist, and I have a specialty in First Nations and Métis research. So some of what we'll be talking about later, I think is going to tie into some of the genealogy work that I do. So I'm happy to be here and looking forward to our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I just wanted to pepper in. I'm also a genealogist. I absolutely love genealogy, and it's kind of what guided me to working with the center is archive work and finding out all those nitty-gritty questions that come with that question of who am I, where do I come from, all that sort of things. And I'd say it's been a couple of years, but the last time I visited the center, I know they were working on those curated spaces and that development of the old former site of the residential school and how that's developed.
Yes, so we actually just had the installation done for the final phase of that exhibit. That was done last week. And so we're going to have a soft opening for survivors at the end of the month. And then the grand opening for that is going to be at the survivor gathering in August. So definitely anybody who's interested in seeing more about the exhibit, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'm sure we can have my email available for people. You're welcome to reach out and we can do guided virtual tours of the exhibit if anyone is interested in that.
Wonderful. I'm going to give you a quick reminder at the end just to share the exact same information if anyone missed it at the start. So we have it there as bookends on either side. But with that, I'm going to turn to Jessie. Jessie, if you would like to give a quick introduction about yourself, and then we'll start jumping into some of those questions.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kayla. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. This is also my first NCTR dialogue session, so I'm very much looking forward to it and hearing what Jenna has to say about her work. There's there's a lot of similarities between the work we do. So I'm looking forward to the open dialogue here today. So a little bit about myself. Like Kayla mentioned, I'm the acting head of archives here at the NCTR. A little bit of background about myself. My family, we are French Canadian, Métis, and Scottish. And I live here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, on Treaty 1 territory. Grew up in Manitoba, moved around quite a bit, and I've been here in Winnipeg since the early 2000s, which feels like a long time ago now. And I live here with my family. My wife and I, we have 2 young kids and a dog. I have to make sure that I don't forget our dog as well. So part of my role here at the NCTR is working very closely with our archive staff, our ever-growing archive staff, to make sure that we can fulfill the mandate of the NCTR, specifically around continuing to build out the archival repository to document the history and legacies of the residential school system. And a big part of that is facilitating access to those records, specifically access for survivors and their families. And more recently, over the past couple of years, that's been inclusive of community-led research efforts. That's required us to sort of pivot the way that we provide that access to records to community-led researchers on a much larger and grander scale. So I'm sure we'll be getting into a bit more of the nitty-gritty about that during the dialogues here today.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for sharing. And with that, I'm going to turn to Jenna and ask one of the first kind of questions I have here. Knowing the kind of length that the NCTR has been opened is much shorter compared to the Shingwauk Center. There's quite a bit of history when it comes to the center's own holdings. And so my question that I want to ask is whether you can tell us a little bit more about those archives and some of the struggles you might be encountering or have encountered given that more lengthy history at the Shingwauk Center.
Yeah, so the Shingwauk Residential School Center was really formed out of the survivor reunions that were held in the 80s and the 90s. So the Shingwauk Residential School closed in 1970. 11 years later, in 1981, the survivors held their first reunion. And that was really essentially a high school reunion for them. They had planned, to see old friends and to, just visit with each other, really. And they started to record interviews and gather photographs and gather documents. And then they held another reunion in 1991. And at that point was where they really started talking about their experiences at the residential school. So they had done all their visiting the 10 years prior to that. And then this reunion in 91 was to really start talking about what had happened to them at the school. So they were doing a lot more interviews, recording, and a lot more gathering of documents. So it very much is a grassroots archive, really based on what the survivors had access to. We have lots of materials that were donated by former staff members as well. So that's sort of the main sort of core of the collection, is materials from Shingwauk. But we do have lots of records from Spanish, which is the next closest residential school to us. It's about 2 hours away. And it was the school that most affected Garden River, which is the closest reserve to us. It is located like 10 minutes down the road from us. So we do have lots of materials because it is really relevant to the local community. And people, locally were trying to find a place to store these records. And so we were here. And so, yeah, the center, as I mentioned, is governed jointly by Algoma University and the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association. So all the staff are employees at Algoma, but we get most of our direction from the survivors. And I think a lot of the challenges, and I'm sure these are the same challenges that the NCTR is facing, is that we have a lot of documents. We have a lot of stuff to go through. A lot of it is not digitized. A lot of it will never be digitized. We don't have indexes for a lot of it. So when people come in to do research and they say, my grandmother attended Shingwauk and I want to know about her time here, sometimes it's really hard for us to figure out what records to even start looking at. We sort of have to, figure out time period and figure out where that person came from. and then just kind of flip page by page through the records. We are working on indexing and doing more digitization, but it's a huge time-consuming project. And there's lots of other things going on. And if requests are coming in constantly, I don't have time to sit off at the side and index everything if I'm trying to, get information for somebody as soon as possible. Another one of the sort of struggles that we have is, I sort of lost my train of thought here. But yeah, I just think the amount of records that we have is kind of a struggle. And when we have a lot of people, coming into the center, sometimes they don't even know, like they know a family member attended residential school, but they don't know what residential school they attended. So the lack of information that people themselves have can make it really difficult for us to search through our records. We want to help people as much as we can. But when somebody is like, I have a family member who attended, don't know when, don't know where, but they attended. It's like, okay, let's see if we can figure this out. But sometimes we can't. And I think that's sort of one of the biggest struggles is when we can't find information for people. I get really frustrated with that because you really want to, people are really struggling with this lack of information about their family's experiences at residential school. And so to not have that information, despite the fact that our archive is fairly large and that we have this long history, lots of records just don't exist. So it is hard to deal with that and to help people kind of work through the disappointment of not being able to find information about their family members.
I just have a few questions I just kind of wanted to build upon that. Based upon the collection, are you primarily working with English language records, or are there any French language records in there as well?
No, it's mostly English. Shingwauk was an Anglican school, and so it mostly was English staff members. There were a few Indigenous staff members, but I don't think there was really much French. I think there was a few French students who attended, but they would have spoken or would have been taught English. The curriculum would have been entirely in English. So yeah, the few sort of French records we might have would be like any government issued records if they were required to be issued in French and English, but then they're also in English. Like we would just have the French translation along with it. But yeah, it's mostly in English. We do have a few Anishinaabe resources as well, and some Cree resources. So we're trying to sort of expand, our holdings around those languages. But yeah, mostly English right now.
The last associated one I just wanted to touch upon is, what would you say is kind of the biggest challenge when it comes to digitization and indexing? Would it be the funding and requiring to secure project funding, or is there other challenges that we might not be expecting?
Yeah, I think it's mostly related to that, just staff capacity. We are a very small team. We only have 2 permanent staff, and then we have 2 contracted staff that are part of our site search team. Because the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association is working on a site search on the property. So we do have 2 archive staff that are dedicated to that project. But yeah, we only have 2 permanent staff, and it's really just me working on digitization. At this point, we have had projects in the past that have been funded to digitize specific collections, specific digitization projects. But in the last couple of years, it's really just been on an on-demand basis, which means that we don't really get a whole lot of stuff done. It's like if somebody requests something, we'll flip, as I said, we go through a box and we flip through all the pages and we find that one page with the person's name on it. And we scan the one page, and then that's all we're really able to do. So if we had, the funding to be able to hire more staff to do dedicated digitization projects, or dedicated indexing projects. I think for me, indexing is really the most important thing at this point, because especially for records that we have that are handwritten, we can't always use optical character recognition on them. And so if we don't have an index of that, we can have it digitized, but it's just as inaccessible as if it was just a paper copy. Means that we can send people a digital copy if we're able to find it and know that, the person they're looking for is in that document. But the indexing for me is a really important thing, and that really cuts down on our search time as well. So if I know, if somebody comes in and they say, my grandmother attended in the 50s, okay, we have a couple boxes that are related to records from the 50s. It's going to take me forever to go through all those boxes, regardless of whether they're digitized or not. But if I know that in box 2, folder 5, page 10, it has that person's name, then I can immediately hone in on that, and it's much faster. And then means, I can take on a lot more requests. I can find other documents that have that person's name on it. So indexing for me is a really important thing. But again, staff capacity, we just don't have the time to do that indexing. I love data entry and I love to pick away at it. But if we have, site tours that are being requested, if we have events that are happening, we have research requests going on, I can't just sit and type into a spreadsheet names. So yeah, I think it really all does boil down to the funding and staff capacity.
So kind of moving a little bit, sidestepping to another question, given how many records you have and the work that is needed to go through to actually find records, knowing that there's very sensitive information in these records about traumas, abuses that are happening, injuries, deaths, how do you deal or how do you address vicarious trauma in reading and seeing some of those negative things or events? And does that differ between staff and potentially those patrons or survivors who are coming in also looking at those records?
Yeah, I think that vicarious trauma has been something that I've been struggling the most with lately. And I find that for staff, because we're going through these records every day and we're reading, you almost, you don't really get desensitized to it, but you almost do, where every day it's not bothering you. You're not going home crying every day reading the stuff. And so then you think, oh, okay, I'm fine. Going through this stuff is not a big deal. And then 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, somebody says something and it triggers something and you're just bawling and you're like, I can't do this. Oh my gosh. Ah. And that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. We have one survivor who works very closely with us and she shares her experiences a lot. And I had been sharing her experiences on tours. And because you were saying the same thing over and over on tours, I'm not really, registering that this is an upsetting thing. This is an upsetting experience that I'm talking about because I'm doing it all the time. And then I was sort of starting, it was weighing more and more heavily on me. I had seen an interview that she did where she talked about this experience that I have been talking about. She started crying. And so then I was starting to get, more and more upset as I was telling her experience. And then I was in a completely unrelated meeting. It wasn't even a tour. We weren't even talking about survivor experiences. And I just mentioned this survivor and burst into tears. The person I was in the meeting with was like, are you okay? And I was like, yes, but no. So it is a struggle to go through that kind of stuff. And I think I find it hard because I don't, it's upsetting to me to go through that stuff. So then I feel like I don't want to burden someone else, I feel like it's hard to have an outlet for that. I don't want to go to my coworkers and be like, I just read this horrible thing. You have to deal with it now too, because I'm upset about it. Or go home to my husband and say, I just learned this horrible thing at work. So it can sometimes be hard to have that outlet after you go through that information. And then thinking about our patrons, if I'm this upset by it, and I'm not even Indigenous, I'm not Indigenous. My partner is Indigenous, so I have a personal connection to it, but I don't have that lived experience myself. So if it's that upsetting for me to go through that, I can't imagine how upsetting it would be for somebody who that's their family member that experienced that. So, it can be hard to gauge how is the best way to present this information to this person, making sure we have the supports on site if they are upset. We don't really have the space right now to kind of, usher somebody away and give them some privacy if they are upset by something. We will hopefully in the next couple of years be having a new space built for us, which is going to include some privacy. So if we know ahead of time that records are upsetting, we can say right away, you have a private space to view these records. Or if, they come across something that's upsetting, we can take them into a space and have more cultural supports for them to kind of work through what it is they've experienced. But a lot of time, same how I said for me, that it can be a delayed reaction sometimes. It's the same for the patrons that are coming in. They read it and there's almost on a high of that's my family member. I can't believe you have information about my family member. And they're all excited that we have these records. And then they go home and then they process what it is that they actually just read about their family member's experience. and then they get upset about it. But at that point, they've already gone home, and we don't have, we're not there to help support them. So I think just the main thing I think is to just make people aware that, like, having supports like the supports that are on the bottom of the screen right now, and just making people aware that, you might not feel it now, but you're going to feel it later, and that you need to be, prepared for that. And you need to have those supports, ready to go. We did have somebody that came in a couple weeks ago with their daughter, and they were going through the records, and like I said, they were all excited to be able to find information about their mother they were looking for. And we had a couple pamphlets about different support services, and their daughter was like, you need to take these because you're not feeling it now, but you're going to feel it later. So that it definitely is a struggle, is just being able to provide people with that support when we know that it's a delayed reaction to the information they're reading.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I should note for those watching, I have different questions for both of my speakers, but I did want to turn to Jesse and just get your thoughts on the same subject as well, knowing although you're working primarily on that back end, you're still working with some of the public as well, and what that experience might have been when facing vicarious trauma.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. So that's certainly been something that that we've been working through a lot more recently. Prior to the children being found in Kamloops, we were primarily working with individuals and family members, and primarily over correspondence. So it was a different kind of relationship, and myself not being on sort of the front lines and having to field phone calls and that sort of thing. It was certainly a different experience for myself compared to other staff members. But over the past couple of years, working more directly with communities, especially around topics around missing children, unmarked burial sites, just the subject matter has become a lot more intense for those who are making the requests, and a lot more intense for the archive staff as well, who are meeting on probably a weekly basis, and meeting over Zoom calls, team calls, meeting in person, meeting in community, meeting at national conferences where there's a lot more face-to-face. That type of relationship that we're starting to build with family members and community members has certainly intensified. So we are working to make sure that we offer different types of training for staff around self-care and that sort of thing, and ensuring that we have cultural supports available on hand for those who want to engage in that way. So and we're continuously learning as well. It seems like each week we have a new type of request, a new type of situation that it always feels like this is a new type of request, and each one is slightly different. So there is no sort of one size fits all type of approach to doing this work. It's really just about getting to know people, getting to know about their background, getting to know about what they're interested in learning more about, and then sort of tailoring, what type of services we can provide to them.
I think related to this, I sort of have a question for Jesse, because I know we've been doing a lot of this sort of similar stuff related to unmarked burials and missing children. Do you find like how are you dealing with going through that? Like, I find that is one of the most upsetting, types of documents to go through, is to search for children who didn't go home. So like, how are you finding that? Like, are you okay?
Yeah, like this, I would say this winter has definitely been sort of the most challenging time for myself and for a lot of the staff. I've been at the NCTR since 2014 now, so it's almost nine years. And the work has always been heavy work, but it's certainly ramped up, and I think we're sort of adjusting still and trying to figure out how to sort of balance, the care and service that we provide for survivors and family members, and the care and support we provide to ourselves and for staff. So it's certainly been we're sort of learning as we go and adapting, and it hasn't been perfect, and we're going to try things and learn from it. And that's all we can do.
Yeah, I find, like I talked about earlier, feeling like sometimes I can't tell my coworkers what it is that I've just read because I don't want to upset them. But I think that one of the things that has been really helpful for us is, because we are such a small team, we're all really close, and we go out, we do activities together outside of work. To be able to go and have lunch together or play board games, like we just had a board game night the other night. So having those kind of outlets has been how we sort of deal with what it is that we're reading. Just stepping away from, we're not even going to talk about what we just learned at work today. We're not going to talk about that person that came in and was upset. We're just going to, have fun and play a game or just enjoy each other's company. I think that's a really good way to like de-stress, and something that we've been doing a lot more of, because like you said, it is totally different now with this kind of heavier stuff, and with all the site searches going on. And it just seems like, every month there's a new school that has done a site search and has the results now. And it just, and I'm sure everybody is dealing with, like, everybody that's reading the news is just kind of being re-traumatized by seeing every new school. Obviously it's important, like we need to know, but it is difficult to be seeing that constantly. Oh, another school just found this many children. Another school just found this many children. It's a hard thing to be listening to all the time.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we've been doing a lot of puzzling lately here, which is
a good one.
Like a really good team activity too. I'm not very good at it, so I might get like one or two pieces in the puzzle, but then I still feel like I've contributed something.
Right, that's a good one. We should take up that idea as well. It sounds like fun.
Yeah. I also started playing Pokemon Go. I'm super late to the game, but I've been trying to make an effort to walk away from my computer, because it's easy to kind of stay there for meetings, emails, whatever, and then go over coffee breaks and I'll eat lunch here at my desk. But I've been making a greater effort to step away from my desk for coffee breaks, lunch breaks, going for walks, especially that it's getting a bit
too. Yeah, we've been trying to do walks around campus every day. Yeah,
we just have to watch out for geese. I don't know if you have the same issue.
We have bears. There's a bear on campus the other day.
A little bit of a different challenge for sure, but actually, Jesse, you followed up to the question that I was going to ask, or some of your own thoughts when it comes to activities to help with that. But you addressed it. We shared. That's perfect. Which means I can turn my question back to Jenna. I got one more for you before we switch things over, and then I have some more questions for you, Jesse.
Sounds good.
Just discussing right now how heavy this work can be. But on the flip side, on the other end, there's also a great number of rewards. I'm wondering if you can kind of share just a little bit about some of the rewards or positive experiences you've had doing this kind of work as well.
Yeah, so I think kind of what I mentioned before, where people, are excited to be finding information about their family members. Some people come in with no expectations. They think that we won't have anything, and they're asking just in case. And then turns out we have tons of stuff. Like we know, like Shingwauk was an industrial school, so students learned specific trades. So learning what trade their family member was learning, or what grade they were in, what after school activities they were in. Potentially connecting with people who attended Shingwauk with them, who might have been their friends, and inviting them to the gatherings. The gatherings are always a really joyful event. There is, they do talk about their experiences and talk about their traumas, but a lot of it is just seeing friends again. Like what that original reunion was for is these people haven't seen each other in a whole year. Or when we had COVID, we weren't able to do it for a couple of years. So those are always really great events. They're really great healing events too. Like there is lots of just great energy at those gatherings. And just lots of fun. Like we always have really great laughs. Like the survivors, they're just hilarious people. They're really fun to spend time with. So those are really, really nice events. And yeah, I think just seeing the excitement that people feel when they're finding information about their family members that they didn't know, especially photographs. We have a really good photograph collection. That's one of our most popular collections at the center, is all of our photo albums. And so usually when people come in, we immediately direct them to the photo albums while we're, off in the background looking for the records. We say, flip through these albums and, see if you recognize anybody or see if your family members are labeled. We don't have names for everybody. That was one of the sort of big projects that was done in the early 2000s, I think sort of mid 2000s. All of these photos were collected into photo albums and they were taken out to communities. They were on display at the gatherings. And so people could come in and flip through and say, oh, I recognize that person. That's this person. They write their name, in pen in our printed photo albums. So it's always really cool, when people are able to find their family, or sometimes survivors even find pictures of themselves that they didn't know existed. We had a survivor who was just visiting one day. She was just sort of hanging out in the center and she was flipping through one of the photo albums, and we had a school group that was in on a tour. And so the school group was in and we were talking about the photo albums and how this is such, an important project. And the survivor's just kind of sitting there quietly. And as we're talking about these photo albums, she goes, oh, that's me. It kind of showed all the kids. She was like, I didn't even know this picture existed. So it was kind of, a good example of how important that project was directly in front of the kids. Which was really great. So that's always, a really happy occurrence when people are able to find images of themselves or their family members that they've never seen, especially when you have intergenerational survivors, like grandchildren of survivors or great-grandchildren of survivors who have never seen what their grandparents or great-grandparents looked like as young people. To say like, oh man, like you're good looking. Like that's one of the things we hear a lot, which is a lot of fun. So yeah, I think that's one of the really joyful parts of the job is being able to satisfy people's curiosity and say, this is where you came from. Connecting people back with that information is really important for me. And that's one of the things I love most about being a genealogist too, is, and I've talked to people about this before. I think with non-Indigenous genealogy, a lot of it is it's discovery. People didn't know this information before. Whereas I always sort of describe with Indigenous people, it's recovery, because that's information that shouldn't have been lost. Like a lot of Indigenous communities are oral communities. And so they share that information, they pass it on generation to generation. But colonization and residential schools interrupted that. And so information that otherwise would have been passed is lost because these families are separated. And so being able to give that information back as opposed to a discovery of information that was unknown, I think is really important work, and it's really nice to be able to help people recover that and reconnect with their communities.
Just kind of one final question there before we move to Jessie is there a particular photo that stands out into your mind, a very memorable piece that you think of when it comes to that full collection? I know we have copies of some of those albums here at the NCTR, and some of those pieces we like to share as well.
Yeah. I don't know that any particular photo really sticks out. I mean, we have so many. One that I was working with recently, Tanya Talaga, who I'm sure both of you know, is a prominent author. She just recently wrote an article in the Globe and Mail about researching her family members that passed away at Shingwauk. And she referenced a picture from the NCTR collection about some students at Shingwauk, and just sort of talking about generally how a lot of photos are unidentified. And how this particular photo, all we know is that these were orphans who went to Shingwauk. And after the article came out, I emailed her and I was like, I know who those are. So that picture right now is sort of in my mind because I've been, helping her learn more about those students And certainly, you know, we'll share that information with the NCTR, because I think the NCTR didn't have the information of the students' names. But because they're students from Shingwauk, we have a lot of that information. So yeah, that picture is kind of sticking in my mind right now. There's another photo we have from, I believe it's 1887. So like, it's an older photo. My sort of focus at Shingwauk has been researching the older period. So the first sort of 2 to 3 decades of the school. So we have a photo of a group of students from Shingwauk who traveled to Montreal for Queen Victoria's Silver Jubilee celebration. And there are lots of students. I think there's probably close to 20 students in that photo. And it's a photo that we share a lot because there's so many students in them. So a lot of people have ancestors that are in that photo. And there's a particular family that one of the students, I think I've met like 6 or 7 of her grandchildren. And so every time, you know, one of them comes and they say, oh, I'm looking for this student, I'm like, I know exactly who you're talking about. And I pull out the photo, and we have a couple other photos of this student. So that photo, you know, sticks in my mind as well, because it is pulled out quite often for people who are descendants of the students in those photos. And because we know a lot about those students. We have, you know, letters about them. We have other pictures of them. Kind of a bit more information about what their day-to-day life at the school would have been like. That's, you know, always really interesting for people to be able to say, you know, not only do we have a picture of them, we have all of this corresponding information that goes along with that photo.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm going to kind of lob that question to Jesse, knowing that we here at the NCTR, we have the same sorts of struggles, lots of photographs, not a lot of names attached, wanting to put a face to the name. And so, Jesse, I'm wondering if you could touch just a little bit upon a memorable picture that stands out to you, and kind of connecting on some of those photos, knowing in my presentation sharing, right now we have about 21,000 photographs on our database. But of course, our collection is very broad, very vast. And so that being just a small section, I'm wondering, yeah, if you could share a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I think the one that comes to mind for me, and it's a photograph that's not publicly available yet, but we traveled to Southern Ontario, and we met with a survivor. His name was Glenn Jourdain, and we met with him because he was sort of holding and caring for a lot of records related to the school that he attended. So we wanted to meet with him to learn from him, and he was wanting to share his residential school story as well. So we traveled and we took his statement, and then he provided copies of some of the photographs that he had within his own collection. And the one that I remember mostly, and he gave us a tour of the church as well, where a lot of the content was held. So there were reproductions of these photographs on the walls in large format, and there was one picture in particular. There must have been over 100 individuals, student, staff in the picture, and every one of them was named on the photograph. So for me, that one really stands out a lot, just because most of the photographs we don't have anything from, you know, as far as the context, the individuals within the photograph. We just know sort of what repository it came from. Sometimes we might know a rough date range, and we know it's a photograph. Sometimes we don't even know what school a photograph is from. So to have this example of a photograph where so much care and attention went to identifying everyone within the photograph, yeah, that one stands out for me the most.
Thank you for sharing it, and just kind of building upon that, knowing we have a very vast collection, knowing that we are still doing document collection or accessioning. I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit about why we don't have all the records that are potentially out there, and kind of still what needs to be done to get access and bring those records into the NCTR collection?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a big question. Mainly, so the records that we do house were primarily collected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which had a very short window, a 5-year mandate, extended to 6 years. But within that time frame, their mandate encompassed document collection, statement gathering, national and regional events. So it was a short time period to identify relevant records to residential school, digitize, and produce those copies of those records to the TRC. So within that time frame, they acquired roughly about 4 million records. We're still working through it all. And as Jenna mentioned, doing the metadata tagging is a bit of a beast. So of those 4 million records, when we sort of took over from the TRC and inherited that content, those records, the databases, our goal was to migrate into a new system, one that was standards based, so that tagging could be sort of standardized across the board, rather than having different sort of levels of tagging or descriptions based on which repository the record came from, because the records came from roughly 150 different archives across the country. So our job was to sort of normalize that all into one repository and then standardize how all that coding or tagging goes. So we're now in a really good spot, and now we're sort of looking forward and looking to continue that collection mandate, knowing that there's still quite a few records that weren't identified during the TRC's mandate. So one of the biggest projects we're working on right now for document collection is with the Government of Canada, specifically CIRNAC, and working with about 12 other federal government departments on going back and doing a further analysis of the records held by the Government of Canada to sort of look at what was disclosed to the TRC to better understand what's left to be disclosed to the NCTR. So that project is underway right now. And we know that the number of records from that process is going to be huge again. So just getting a good handle on sort of all of that tagging and description and preservation work, and making sure that your systems are all up and running to be able to take in additional records has been a really big priority for us. And it's not just the Government of Canada. We're working with a lot of church organizations, the Oblates of the Mary Immaculate. We're working with them, who has records in a number of different repositories across the country. That's sort of some additional research work that we're undertaking as well, just to better understand where these records ended up as they shifted across the country over time. And just really working to build those relationships with those record holders to get copies of those records. And then also working with partners like Shingwauk as well, knowing that they have a very comprehensive collection related to a smaller number of residential schools. They have expertise in that area. So when we're working with survivors and individuals requesting records related to Shingwauk residential schools specifically, then we can provide what we have, but we can also point them in the direction to Jenna as well to gain further knowledge around that particular school.
Yeah, and like you said, I know you guys are working with other organizations to get records, but we also are working on a partnership right now to share records back and forth.
Exactly.
So that's sort of one digitization project that I'm actually working on right now, is some records that we're sending you guys, and just trying to make sure that we have all the metadata related to it. But yeah, I think that's definitely a struggle that lots of people are facing, is I think we're kind of siloed in these different institutions, and we haven't really talked to each other too much so far. So hopefully, as we go forward, we'll share more information back and forth.
Yeah. We should probably set up like monthly meetings just to talk.
That would probably be good.
There's just so much overlap in the work. So I think that might be a good idea.
Mm-hmm. And even just to know like where to point people, like you said, like obviously we're a really obvious repository for records from Shingwauk, but if you have people who have family members from other schools, sometimes it's hard to know, where those records might be held elsewhere. You don't know what you don't know, right? So it'd be great, for all the archives that might have, residential school records to all kind of chat together and say, we have stuff from here. So if you have a request related to this, send them our way, or we have stuff over here. I think that is a struggle. Sometimes we get requests, we get requests from people who don't have family members at Shingwauk. They have family members at other residential schools, but they live in Sault Ste. Marie. And so they come to us as a resource, and they say, I have a family member that attended a residential school over here, or like I said earlier, I don't know where they attended residential school. And so sometimes it's hard to know where to direct them first if we don't know who holds records for the school they might have attended.
Yeah. And we've been talking about like creating a national network of record repositories that hold records related to residential schools, just so we can keep in touch and talk through some of the challenges like this. I know the UBC History and Dialogue Center has started something kind of like that for BC specific schools. I know they're working very closely with the province of BC and a lot of the lead communities for their school sites there as well. So I think that's a pretty good model to kind of look at and replicate across other provinces, territories, and nationally.
Right. Yeah. The metadata nerd in me is like, give me all the metadata, give me all the info.
Oh yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just kind of building upon that, knowing we've seen an influx in the past couple of years. Really, I can pinpoint, I think we can all kind of pinpoint what that was, which is the Kamloops announcement in May of 2021, which really brought the topic of residential schools back to the forefront, with more of that focus on missing children and unmarked burials and all the challenges that are connected to that work. And so, Jesse, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit on kind of the increase that we have seen, as well as a little bit on what we've been doing around missing children and unmarked burials, and sort of the phases of the project where we are at now.
Yeah, so the increase has been intense. We had like prior to that point, our capacity in-house to receive access request, research reference types of requests, do the research and be responsive to those requesters. We used to have like a really kind of a ridiculously small backlog. Our response time was really short. We sometimes didn't have a backlog, which is kind of unheard of for archives. But then when the announcement happened, we went from maybe getting 5 to 10 survivor requests per month to getting about, I think in the beginning it was something like 60 to 70 requests per month. And it slowly tapered down a little bit, but we're still getting about 40 to 50 survivor and third-party requests each month, so it's been an increase. I'm not very good at math, but it's been a very big increase. Like 10 times kind of thing. So it has been a challenge. We've increased our staff capacity to help out with that major increase in requests. We've really looked at the way that we process requests. So it's it's been an opportunity for us to reflect on our own internal processes to adapt and change to be more responsive. And we're working more closely as well with the federal government, which ties back into missing children and unmarked burial funding and research. So we've been able to ramp up capacity for research a bit there as well. So that leads into the increased demand for access to records for community-led researchers. So in 2019, when we launched the National Student Memorial Register, we were sort of the ones doing a lot of the research. There were schools like Brandon, Regina, who had been doing research as well for a number of years. But generally speaking, the sort of research and the names that were identified at that time were from work that was done by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So now there are a lot more communities that are leading this work, which is really great to see. So we're trying to figure out how we can best support that research and best support those communities in doing that work, while still sort of balancing our sort of national scope and mandate to continue developing this national register. So for us, it has been really about building these relationships with communities. And going back to one of your previous questions to Jenna about sort of what are some of the sort of, I think your question was like, what are some of the positives of this type of work? Yeah. So for us, one of our biggest challenges in the beginning with a small staff was trying to build those relationships with communities across the country, because we didn't have that type of capacity to do the work. But now we've been sort of thrusted into doing this work, which has been really, it's been mutually beneficial, so that we can provide communities with access to our internal database to do research that's led by their own researchers. And then on the flip side, we are able to start building these important relationships so we can better understand the needs of communities when it comes to research, when it comes to what types of records are important as far as continuing this document collection, because a lot of the communities have a lot of insight into these records, oftentimes more insight than we do, because they've been doing a deep dive on specific records for a number of years. So they will point us in certain directions and be like, hey, have you looked at these types of records or those types of records? So the sort of knowledge sharing back and forth has been really beneficial on that front.
Just sort of kind of building upon that, working with communities, I'm wondering what's in store for that next phase when we're looking at adding more names or being more inclusive to the memorial register that we have on the website, on our internal piece as well, knowing that there are a great number of gaps that exist when it comes to those paper records.
Yeah, so right now we just wrapped up phase 2 of the Missing Children Research Project. It had been going on for a couple years, and it was looking at those records that hadn't been researched by the TRC. So it was about 2.2 million records. And part of the researchers' role was to do a scoping exercise to identify, of those 2.2 million records, which records require eyes-on review, where a researcher will actually read the record in full to identify information around children who passed away at residential school. So again, this goes back to the importance of doing that tagging of the records, because that scoping exercise is based on keyword searching, because you can't look at 3 million records. So through a series of, it was close to 200 different keyword search terms, we had identified about a subset of 500,000 records or so that the researchers reviewed in full. So part of the findings were they provided us with a new list of names that they had identified within those records. So the next phase of work that needs to happen is we need to start bringing these names back to their families, back to their home communities, so that we can, it's partly to have a community-led verification process before we add new names to the register. And another part of it is also following the wishes of the families and communities, whether there's a ceremonial aspect of it, commemoration. It's really just following their lead in looking at sort of like this name repatriation process and bringing these children home.
I think that ties into what we were talking about earlier, just sharing information back and forth between repositories, because we have, a lot of those community connections to all the communities that were affected by Shingwauk. So whereas you, because you're dealing with all the schools across Canada, might not have the capacity to go into every community that is affected by Shingwauk, we have a bit more of that capacity to do that. So I know when the Memorial Register was released, there was some information that I knew about that was incorrect on there. And so then I went and did a bunch of research and then shared information back on corrections and new information. So I think that definitely highlights the positives and the need for relationships between repositories to get more in depth into that community connection.
Exactly. Yeah, we can't do it alone. We shouldn't do it alone, especially when there's organizations like Shingwauk who have already, worked with communities. You've built that trust. So that's definitely something that we're going to be leaning on a bit more, especially in this next phase.
And building upon that as well, we're seeing advancements in technology every year. And I'm wondering, have advancements in archives and this kind of work, have they helpful? Has it been hindering work? Is there any things that you're kind of looking forward to down the line, which would really help this kind of work?
Yeah, so Jenna mentioned it earlier with the OCR, optical character recognition. That's something that we've been sort of working on a bit more, because some of the content that we did receive was OCR'd. A lot of it wasn't. Some of it was old OCR. So we're sort of looking at different types of technology. And for those who are listening and don't know what it is, I'll see if I can explain it well. But basically, if you have a letter, it'll sort of scan the letter and then create a layer on top of that file that's a text file, and then you can then use that for doing further text searches. So let's say if it has someone's name in it, if the OCR layer is done well, then if you do a search for that individual's name, then that record will pop up because it's within that sort of text layer. Obviously, it's not a perfect science or process, but we have done a fair bit amount of work on looking at the different tools that are available, whether open source or a paid service, and looking at sort of the best bang for our buck, especially around those handwritten documents, knowing that those are definitely one of the most least accessible types of records. So if we can find a way to at least generate that text layer, and then we could then edit that layer as we go along, then we can continuously increase the accessibility and discoverability of those records.
Accessibility is something that I've been thinking a lot recently, and I think there's sort of there's so many layers to accessibility. Like there's, the physical accessibility, whether you can actually access the document. Then there might be, any disability accessibility. So like, do we have it in other formats? Do we have, an OCR version that can be read by a screen reader or that is word searchable? But then there's also like the intellectual accessibility. Like, is somebody going to understand the context or understand like what it is that they're reading? So like, there's so many aspects to accessibility that I think about a lot. But I think the sort of accessibility for people that have disabilities is something that I've been thinking more through recently. Is just, but also like different learning styles too. Like somebody might struggle to read something, but if they hear it spoken, it's like they can understand it completely. Or if they see a visual of what the document is trying to tell them, like they, some just those different learning styles. Thinking through how we can, think about the different ways that people learn information, and what is the best way to provide that information so that they can fully understand it. If they learn better by listening, or if they learn better by seeing, or if they learn better by reading. So I think like our virtual tour project is, I think, sort of one of those things that is sort of helping with that, because it's another way to access the site and access the records. But one project that we're working on right now is transcriptions of some letter books that were digitized. This is the project that I was originally hired for back in 2019, was to digitize these letters. And this was all the outgoing correspondence from the first principal of Shingwauk and the fourth principal of Shingwauk. And so those books were digitized. I made notes on all the letters. They're handwritten and the writing is really hard to read. Even sometimes for me, who spent 6 months looking at nothing but this guy's handwriting. So OCR doesn't really work very well on these documents. So we've been doing transcriptions of them, but also we're looking at using another project that basically maps everything. And so we are going to record audio files of these letters. And then you can tag it in different ways. And then as the audio is moving through the letter, the map will move around if it's talking about like different areas. So a great way to visualize like the effect of Shingwauk, because Shingwauk affected 85 different communities. But there are connections like all across North America. We had a student from Africa who attended Shingwauk. There are connections back to England in terms of funding and religious connections and things like that. So having that visual map to show, all the ways that Shingwauk affected, so many different people or was affected by so many different people is a really interesting way to sort of learn about that information. Especially the letter books are all, from the early years of Shingwauk. And because a lot of the survivors we have with us today are people who attended, from the 50s onward or from the 40s onward, there's not as much information known about those early years of the system. So to have it accessible in all these different ways means that so many more people can learn about that early history of the system.
Yeah, that's a good point about the mapping. That's been a really important component of our sort of archival access piece as well. Just knowing that not everybody is comfortable or fluent in sort of navigating a hierarchical archival database or access system. So for us, having that map component where somebody can click on a school or click on an event or a different type of entity like that, and then have a direct avenue within the records is really important. And we've been looking at expanding sort of our mapping capabilities as well. I'm interested to hear more about the one that you mentioned where it moves with the audio. That sounds really neat. We're looking at different platforms like ArcGIS that has story maps, and just to find ways to bring out those more personal stories, and find different avenues to share survivor testimonies in a way that, again, makes it more accessible, ties it back to the archive as well, and bring in archival records, photographs, and different types of media together.
And also just to provide connections to records that people might not have thought are connected. And I think having that, really in-depth contextual knowledge is what's needed to understand that. But obviously each individual person coming in is not going to understand, the full, spectrum of that history of that particular school. They're just looking for their family member who attended. But having all that contextual information can really provide a lot more information about what their experience was like at the school. And so, I think having those, and it all comes down to metadata again, like having those tags to connect things together and connect things in different ways, so that people who may have just typed in their community name in the search box, or may have just typed in their grandfather's name in the search box, are able to find all these other records that their grandfather isn't mentioned in, or their community is not mentioned in, but provides further context, like a document that has a student, menu, like for what students ate. The grandfather's name is not going to be mentioned on that menu, but knowing that that's what the students ate while their grandfather was there is going to provide so much more information about that student's experience.
Yeah, for sure. And we know that sort of the way that people generally approach an archival database is they want it to sort of act like a Google search. Yeah. So if we can wrap our head around how to replicate that type of search result within an archival environment, then we can find better ways to link related records like that. And like one example that we've been thinking about quite a bit lately is we have all the audio visual recordings for RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and now we have all the audio visual content for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they had a lot of overlapping in terms of which communities, which cities or towns they attended, collected statements, did public sharing circles and panels and that type of thing. So, there's an opportunity there to sort of on a mapping level, on an archival database level, create those two layers, which within an archival database, they're in two separate series, so they're not connected. But then if you bring them together on a map or with different tags, then when someone is looking at one particular video, they can see, oh, hey, this actually happened 20 years prior. Let's kind of see what they were talking about there and kind of start making those connections.
Now we've reached a point in time where we'd like to turn to our audience to ask some of the questions that have come through. And so I just wanted to reiterate, for anyone still here with us and would like to ask a question, please feel free to comment either in the YouTube or Facebook. And I see Josie had a question, and I think it's kind of related in kind of very broadly. Their question is, where can I find records from the 1830s for First Nations? And I'm wondering if I can broaden that. What are some good repositories or areas where they can kind of focus on some of those records, where they might find that information, and potentially if that is linked to residential schools or other systems? And I don't know if anyone wants to take that first go of it. Jenna, it looks like you were.
Yeah, I mean, this is related to a lot of the genealogical work I do. But I think that local archives are always the best place to start, because they are local. They will have, information that like a provincial archive or a federal archive might not have, or an archive, specific to an institution might not have. So I think those are the best places to start first. And often those local archives or local libraries that have an archive inside them are connected to genealogical societies, and genealogists are like the most nitpicky people. Like, they'll know where everything is and they keep lists of everything. And so they are great people to ask about that kind of local history. So if you have, a specific community you're looking for and a specific time period, getting in touch with a genealogist who is from that area or who researches that time period, they're going to know like all of the repositories that have that information. They're going to know all of the places to look. They're going to know all the people to ask. So looking for those local resources, I think, is a great first step. And then after that, expanding out. And often those local resources will know who to connect you with. Like they'll connect you to the bigger archive if they don't have stuff there. They'll connect you to this other local archive. And I think too, like just understanding the history of the area you're researching, because borders change all the time. Like that's a very colonial thing, is to have these borders shift constantly. And so if you're in one area in the 1830s, it might have been named totally different. It might have been in a completely different county. It might have been in a different province, because those borders have changed as well. So just kind of getting a general grasp on the history of the area you're researching, I found that's been really helpful for me to know where to go when looking for a specific time period.
Jesse, did you have any comments about that one? Or you'd like to, we can move on to this next question, which is directed at us, is
Sure.
How are we finding, how to find out more information about what we're doing at the NCTR?
Yeah, so our social media platforms is a great way to stay connected. We have a newsletter. We have an events section on our website that provides information about upcoming events. Or you could always reach out to learn a bit more about the work we do. Kayla, I'm not sure if you have anything else to add. You're probably better suited for that anyways.
Oh, well, I know we have a number of different social platforms, from Instagram, Facebook, which we are posting information more about some of the activities or events that we're engaging in. But I will say, for anyone who's wanting more information about the NCTR very broadly, they can always reach out to request an education-based presentation to learn more about that contemporary history of the NCTR or the TRC, but even go back further to wanting to know more about what is a residential school and what are those residential school experiences. And I see Patricia has a question. Will or does the NCTR have any coroner's record collections related to residential schools?
Yeah, we have some. We don't have a lot, but we are in talks with some of those coroners' offices that have not produced any records yet. And we know that it's going to be ongoing work as well. So there are some coroners' offices that have provided records based on the work of the TRC. But now that we've identified more names, it's going to be a continuous process of providing names of children who passed away at residential school to see if they have responsive records within their holdings.
From Monica, do all of the schools that are still standing hold the names there? I'm on a journey to find out more about my family's past history, and I plan on doing a road trip to Fort Alexander. So that would be the Fort Alexander Residential School, which is now on the land of, well, I should say always has been on the land for Saugeen First Nation.
Yeah, so is the question, like, do the schools that are still standing have lists of student names?
I'm gonna interpret that as yes. I think that's the question.
Okay. So I think, well, the short answer would be no. There are, is it 14 or 16 sites that are still standing, Kayla?
I go between 16 and 17, whether or not.
Okay, so we'll land on 16. And again, this is an area where there's a lot of community-led research that is going on for commemoration purposes. So not only to sort of create a commemorative sort of space on the school sites, but there is funding at the NCTR and with the federal government to do different types of commemoration. It could be ceremony, it could be a feast, it could be a bench, it could be a garden. So there's a lot of work that's going on right now for that. And we are working with a number of communities to provide as many records as we can for a particular school that would have student names on it. So student list, quarterly returns, admissions and discharge records. and those types of documents. So I don't know of any sort of like central space where someone has a definitive, complete list of students from the standing schools, but there's a lot of work that's underway to get towards that goal.
Well, and I think I would add too that I think for some schools, like, I mean, it's a sad thing to say, but I don't think we would ever have all of the names because some records just don't exist and people have passed away, and so names have been lost. So like we have an index for Shingwauk, but there's just like no records from the 20s, like in 20s and 30s. Like there's like a decade and a bit that we just don't have anything for. And that's, you know, long enough ago that nobody's still living that attended at that time. So I think, you know, it's a struggle. We're going through as many records as we can, but I don't think that we would ever have a listing of every student that attended every school.
No. Yeah, and we're also working on sort of an index for all students across all the schools, and we start off with a baseline of about 11.5 million names that were all duplicated because they were pulled from a variety of records. So, you know, one student might have 200 entries within that 11.5 million. So we've sort of whittled it down now to about 750,000, while sort of retaining all the information related to those students that were clustered down, including home, community, attended school, date of birth, student number, and all that kind of stuff. So it's just a lot of work.
Yeah, so well, even separating it out and figuring out, like, are these the same student? That can be really hard sometimes, right now. Especially if it's just like some of the documents we have are just lists of names. Like we know a time period from when they were from, but other than that, like there's no other contextual information. So it's like, okay, we see that same name from the same time period on another page, but do we just coincidentally have another student with the same name who attended roughly around the same time, or is that the same student? Like it's so hard to figure that out sometimes. So we have the same problem in our index where we have a number of people repeated. And that's something that I've been trying to go through, is clean up that database a little bit. And especially when you have two people with different last names or different first names, like they might be recorded in one record with an Indigenous last name, but then recorded in another record with an English last name or a French last name or whatever last name was pushed on them. That's something that I've seen multiple times in our spreadsheet. So you're not alone in having those repeated names and struggling to kind of whittle that down and clear up who's the same person and who's not.
Yeah, we should chat a bit more about that too, because we could provide you with sort of a subset of our database for Shingwauk.
Yeah, for sure.
So another question has come in from Carrie. I was wondering if the NCTR has a listing of research teams from across the country documenting or researching residential schools.
Yeah, so we've got a list of sort of the communities that we're engaging with who are doing this type of work, but we know that there are a lot of different types of researchers doing this work as well in academia and that sort of thing. So our research department is actively working on creating that type of list and trying to create some type of a research network, because there's a lot happening right now. There's a lot of duplication of efforts. So if we can try to sync people together towards common goals, then I think we'd be in a much better place.
Just waiting for any other questions to come in through here, but I think I'll pepper in just a few ones. Jesse, I remember some months ago we were discussing a little bit using, and of course I'm going to butcher it, OSI, ORI, all the acronyms are going through my mind. But anyway, the computer reading document and determining, okay, what is a student number versus what is a nonsensical number versus what is someone's part of a treaty number,
or a band number.
Band number, you name it. And I know working through some of those. Yeah. I'll let you go there. Yeah.
No. Yeah. That's certainly been a really big challenge. So we've been very conservative in our approach to doing this names filtering work, is sort of what the name of our project is. So, and especially around missing children and unmarked burial research. This project has kind of been on the side of our desks for a number of years, but now we've since prioritized the work, because as we're grouping together these names, we're also grouping together all the related records from that individual. So if we had 80 entries for John Doe, and we've determined, okay, based on age or date of birth, student number, first name, last name, everything's matching up 100%. So we've taken those 80 and now we just have one entry. We've still retained the 80 records that John Doe is related to within the database. So for us, when we're identifying names of children who may have passed away at residential school, we can now cross-reference that with our main index of student names to identify additional records related to that student. So we could do then a further pass of research to find added context to that student's life or death.
That's something that we've been struggling to, is just those numbers. It's like, what does this number mean? And I think, again, that's where the sort of contextualizing it comes in too, because you can read that one document that mentions that one student's name, and it has that number, and it's hard to tell whether it's a band number or whether it's a student number or what it is. But then you go to another record, 10 pages on, that is a totally different student. And then it's very clear that, oh, this is a band number because that student and their sibling has the same number. So it must be a band number and not a student number, because you can't have two kids attending school at the same time with the same student number. So I think that's where, again, that just contextualizing, and although it is so time consuming, you have to look at all the pages around that one document to understand all the information you're seeing in that one document that's pertinent.
And the last piece I'll share with that, working with the quarterly returns, we get that full list of students. I like to usually show a quick snapshot. But of course, when reading these records, we always have to keep in mind whoever completed it. We like to think they did it with the appropriate information, with the most accurate information, what they think is important, but we always know that's not the case. And the ones I wanted to highlight specifically is, for quite a long time, I was looking at the Albertan-based ones and finding that they're using an unusual number letter system. Didn't know what it was till we figured out with that talk, actually, Jesse, I realized those are their band numbers. And so without that context, without bringing someone here and telling me what this is, it was an anomaly. It was a mystery. And of course, I still don't know how to read them until we're able to get some sort of source or means to identify what ABC003 could mean. Getting an understanding of what community they came from is going to be a blank. And so with that, we're kind of wrapping up here. And I just wanted to ask whether either of you have any final comments or things you'd like to share. And maybe I'll go to Jesse and then Jenna, because Jenna, I wanted to highlight that event one more time.
Yeah, there's one thing that I kind of wanted to go back on a little bit to touch on, and that is sort of the OCRing, and then having that added searchability piece and increased indexing. It is good in terms of the increased access to information, but then on the flip side, we also have to be cognizant of the access and privacy implication of it as well, because there's a lot of content that is deemed public records, but then if you add this additional layer on, and then people can do searches on the records and identify in individuals specifically within the record, then it can sometimes bring in some issues around privacy. We know that we've seen that where we'll have some survivors that we're working with who want all their records public so that Canada and everyone can better learn and understand exactly what happened at residential school. Whereas on the flip side, you'll have some survivors who do not want their name to be made public or easily searched by anybody who has an internet connection. So, these advances in technology are great for a number of different reasons, but we have to also understand sort of the privacy implications and the right of the students to not be searchable. That's something that I struggle with quite a bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's one thing that is great, that we have the survivors to talk with, and they can sort of, give their thoughts on whether information should be made public or not. Like our student index is not public. So, people can come to us and say, do you have information on this person? And then we go search our index.
Exactly.
Yeah. But then other things as survivors are like, yes, we want all that information available. Like our burial register that we have for Shingwauk has a lot more information than what the NCTR memorial register has, because the survivors wanted it to have that. And, we went and specifically said, like, should it include home community? Should it include, whether they were a student, like, because it was a burial register for the cemetery and their staff and community members and whatever in the cemetery. So just, should it have all this extra information, contextualizing, and the survivor said, absolutely, it should have all that information. So yeah, definitely. But for individuals, it's so hard to go and try and contact every individual. Do you want your name, searchable?
Yeah, and we went through a similar in engagement phase 2 with the student register that we have online. So that is why there's very limited types of information, but then we still have our back end death register that has all the information that we can possibly find.
And Jenna, last comments, last thoughts before we wrap up today.
Yeah, I think it is nice to focus on some of the positives of this work. Like, I think Jesse and I maybe were a little bit of a downer at the beginning talking about working on burial registers, especially, and talking about vicarious trauma. But this job is just so rewarding. Like, it's so great to be able to work with the survivors, and how grateful they are that we are helping them to share their experiences. That's something that is really, really important to me. And as a non-Indigenous person, to have this be my effort at reconciliation is what do the survivors want, and doing whatever I can to make sure that gets done. A lot of what I do is just like, what do you want done? Okay, let me do it. And just running off and doing whatever I can to get it done. But this, I love this job. I love working with survivors, and I love sharing information about residential schools and helping people learn about survivor experiences and things like that. But just to go back to what I said at the beginning of the presentation about the survivors, Shingwauk, or at Algoma University, we do have an exhibit that is a permanent exhibit about residential schools that was created by the survivors. And we just recently installed the final phase of that. And the opening of that is going to be at the Children of Shingwauk gathering in the summer. So the link to their website has been shared. They will share lots of information about that gathering online on their website once they have those details. I think they're just working on finalizing some information about that event. It will be in August. So anybody who is interested in learning more about Shingwauk, has family members who attended Shingwauk, definitely you're welcome to reach out to us at the center, reach out to the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association. The current president, Jay Jones, is quite responsive and is a really great person to talk to. And those gatherings are always really great events. And there's lots going on at the Shingwauk Residential School Center. So yeah, definitely you're welcome to reach out, and hopefully we'll be able to have that virtual tour ready soon, and be able to provide people that as a resource. It'll be a great resource for teachers to use in the classroom, but also for people who aren't able to come on site at Shingwauk, but want to be able to see. We are one of those 16, 17 sites where the building still exists. So to have that as a resource for people to better understand what happened at residential schools is really great. So yeah, certainly you're welcome to reach out to us.
I will say I got to attend kind of that first opening of, I guess, the phase one of the project. I remember walking in, and I still remember the Thunderbird kind of right at the front as you come in.
Yep.
And that it's, as you said, when it comes to accessibility, not everyone can come out. So it's so great to hear that there's going to be a more kind of tour-based piece where we can access this information, see that site virtually for those who can't come down. So that's really exciting. And I just wanted to extend a great big chi-miigwech to both of you on behalf of the NCTR. From here, having our acting head of Director of Research and Archives, Jessie Boiteau, as well as Jenna Lemay from the Shingwauk Residential School Center. I want to thank the audience for joining us here today to learn more about how to do some research on residential school records, some of the repositories that exist out there where you can get this information, some of those challenges that exist, and those success pieces, or I should say those positive pieces that come out in doing this kind of work. With that, I want to say, please watch for news on our next NCTR dialogue happening in May. I hope to see you there. Hi, and until we see each other again.
Miigwech.